speed reading. But ego and the dualities. It follows into Sachidananda. That suffering, evil, limitation can only be the creations, positive and practical effect, negative in essence of a distorting consciousness which has fallen from the total and unifying knowledge of itself into some error of division and partial experience. This is the fall of man typified in the poetic parable of the Hebrew Genesis that follows this deviation from the full and pure acceptance of God and himself, or rather of God and himself, into a dividing consciousness bridged within all the train of the dualities, life and death, good and evil, joy and pain, completeness and warmth, the fruit of a divided being. This is the fruit which Adam and Eve, Purusha and Prakriti, the soul tempted by nature, have eaten. The redemption comes by the recovery of the universal in the individual of the spiritual term in the physical consciousness. Then alone the soul in nature can be allowed to partake of the fruit of the tree of life and be as the divine and live forever. For then only can the purpose of a descent into material consciousness be accomplished. For the knowledge of good and evil, joy and suffering, life and death has been accomplished through the recovery by the human soul of a higher knowledge which reconciles and identifies its opposites in the universal and transforms the divisions into the image of the divine unity. To Satchidananda extended in all things in widest commonality and impartial universality, and death, suffering, evil and limitation can only be at the most at reverse terms shadow forms of their luminous opposites. As these things are felt by us, they loads of a discord, and they formulate separation where there should be unity, miscomprehension where there should be an understanding, an attempt to arrive at independent harmonies where there should be a self-adaptation to the orchestral law, all totality, even if it be only in one scheme of the universal vibrations, even if it be only a totality of the physical consciousness, without position of all that is in movement beyond and behind, must be to that extent a reversion to harmony and a reconciliation of jarring opposites. On the other hand, to suggest the transcendence of the forms of the universe, the dual terms themselves, even so understood, can no longer be justly applicable. Transcendence transfigures, so it does not reconcile, but rather transmutes opposites into something surpassing that opposites their oppositions. At first, however, we must try to relay the individual against the totality that it is necessary for us, otherwise there is no issue from the problems. To realize that the terms in which our present consciousness renders the values of the universe, though practically justified for the purposes of human experience and progress, are not the sole terms in which it is possible to render them and may not be the complete, the right, the ultimate formulas. Just as there may be sense organs of formation of sense capacity, we see the physical world differently and it may well be better because more completely than our sense organs and sense capacity. So there may be other mental and supramental investigations of the universe which surpass our own. States of consciousness there are in which death is only a change in immortal life, pioneer violent backwash of waters of universal delight, limitation and turning of the infinite upon itself, ever circling of the good around its own perfection, and this not in abstract conception only, but in actual vision and in constant and substantial experience. To arrive at such states of consciousness may, for the individual, be one of the most important and indispensable steps of his progress towards self-perfection. Certainly the practical values given by us by our senses and the dualistic sense mind must hold good in their field and be accepted as a standard for ordinary life experience until a larger harmony is ready into which they can enter into and transform themselves without losing hold of the realities which they represent. To enlarge the sense faculties without the knowledge that would give the whole sense values their right interpretation from a new standpoint might lead to serious disorders and incapacities, might unfit for practical life and for the orderly and disciplined use of the reason. Equally, an enlargement of our mental consciousness out of the experience of the egoistic dualities into an unregulated unity with some form of total consciousness might easily bring about a confusion and incapacity for the active life of humanity. In the established order of the world's relativities, this, no doubt, is the root of the injunction imposed in the Gita on the man who has the knowledge not to disturb the life basis and thought basis of the ignorant. For the impelled by the example but unable to comprehend the principle of his action, they would lose their own system of values without arriving at a higher foundation. Such a disorder and incapacity may be accepted personally or accepted by many great souls as a temporary passage or the price to be paid for the entry into a wider existence. But the right goal of human progress must always be effective and synthetic reinterpretation by which the law of that wider existence may be represented in a new order of truths and in a more just and poisoned working of the faculties of the life material of the universe. For the sense the sun goes around, the sun that was for them the center of existence, and the motions of life are arranged on the basis of the misconception. The truth is the very opposite. But its discovery would have been of little use if there were not a science that make the new conception the center of a reason and order, a knowledge putting the right values on the perception. So also for the method consciousness, God moves around the personal ego and all his works and ways were brought to the judgment of our egoistic sensations, emotions and conception or their given values and interpretation, which though a perversion and inversion of the truth of things are yet useful and practically sufficient in a certain development of human life and progress. They are a rough practical systematization of our experience of things valid so long as they dwell in a a certain order of ideas and activities, but they do not represent the last and highest state of human life and knowledge. Truth is the path and not the falsehood. The truth is not that God moves around the ego as the center of the existence and can be judged by the ego and its values of the dualities, but that the divine is itself the center and that the experience of the individual only finds its own truth when it is known in the terms of the universal and the transcendent. Nevertheless, to substitute this conception for the egoistic without an adequate base of knowledge may lead to the substitution of a new but still false and arbitrary ideas for the world and bring about a violent instead of a settled disorder of right values. Such a disorder often marks the inception of new philosophies and religions and initiates useful revolutions. But the true goal is only reached when we can group around the right central conception of a conception, a reason, and effective knowledge in which the egoistic life shall rediscover all its values, transform and corrected. Then we shall possess that new order of truths which will make it possible for us to substitute a more divine life for the existence which we now lead and to effectualize a more divine and poisoned use of our faculties on the life material of the universe. The new life and power of the human integer must necessarily repose on a realization of the great verities which translate into our mode of conceiving things, the nature of the divine existence. It must proceed through a renunciation by the ego of its false standpoint and false identities through its entry into the right relation and harmony with the totalities of which it forms a part and with the transcendences from which it is a descent, and through its perfect self-opening to a truth and law that exceeds its own conventions, a truth that shall be its fulfillment and a law that shall be its deliverance. Its goal must be the abolition of these values, those values which are the creations of the egoistic view of things. Its crown must be the transcendence of limitation, ignorance, death, suffering and evil. The transcendence, the abolition are not possible here on earth and in our human life. The terms of that life are necessarily bound to our present egoistic valuation. If life is in its nature individual phenomenon and not a representation of a universal existence and the breathing of a mighty life spirit, if the dualities which are the response of the individual to its contacts are not merely a response but the very essence and condition of all living, if limitation is the inalienable nature of the substance of which our mind and body are formed, disintegration of death the first and last condition of all life, its the end and its beginning, pleasure and pain, and the inseparable dual stuff of all sensation, joy and grief, the necessary light and shade of all emotion, truth and error, the two poles between which all knowledge must eternally move. Then transcendence is only attainable by the abandonment of human life in a nirvana beyond all existence or by attainment to another world, a heaven quite otherwise constituted than this material universe. It is not very easy for the customary mind of man, always attached to its past and present possession, to conceive of an existence still human, yet radically changed in what we now are fixed we know our fixed circumstances. We are in respect to our possible higher evolution much in the position of the original aim of the Darwinian theory. It would have been impossible for that ape leading its instinctive arboreal life in a primal forest to conceive that there would be one day an animal on earth who would use a new faculty called reason upon the materials of his inner and outer existence, who would dominate by that power his instincts and habits, change the circumstances of his physical life, build for himself houses of store, manipulate nature's forces, sail the seas, ride the air, develop codes of conduct, evolve conscious methods for his mental and spiritual development. And if such a conception had been possible for the ape man, it would still have been difficult for him to imagine. But that by any progress of nature or long effort of will and tendency, he himself would develop into that animal. A man, because he has acquired reason, and still more because he has indulged his power of imagination and intuition, is able to conceive an existence higher than his own and even to envisage his personal elevation beyond his present state into that existence. His idea of the supreme state is an absolute of all that is possible to his own concepts and desirable to his own instinctive aspiration. Knowledge without its negative shadow of error, thus without its negation and experience of suffering. Power without its constant denial by incapacity, purity and plenitude of being without the opposing sense of defect and limitation. It is so that he conceives his God, it is so that he constructs his servant, but it is not so that his reason conceives of a possible earth and a possible humanity. His dream of God and possible earth and a possible human. His dream of God and heaven is really a dream of his own perfection, but he finds the same difficulty in accepting its practical realization here for his ultimate aim as the ancestor he had thought about to believe in himself as a future man. His imagination, his religious aspiration may hold that aim before him, but when his reason asserts itself, rejecting imagination and transcendent intuition, he puts it by as a brilliant superstition contradicted by artifacts of the material universe. It becomes then a Wally's inspiring vision of the impossible. All that is possible is a conditioned, limited and precarious knowledge, happiness, power and good. Yet in the principle of the reason itself, there is a assertion of a transcendence, for reason is in its own whole aim and is in the pursuit of knowledge. The pursuit, that is to say, of truth by the elimination of error. Its view, its aim is not that of a passage from a greater to a lesser error, but it supposes a positive pre-existent truth towards which through the dualities of right knowledge and wrong knowledge we can progressively move. If our reason has not the same instinctive certitude with regard to the other aspirations of humanity, it is because it lacks the same essential illumination inherent in its own positive activity. Our can just conceive of a positive or absolute realization of happiness. Because the heart to which the instinct for happiness belongs to its own form of certitude, is capable of faith, and because our minds can envisage the elimination of unsatisfied want, which is the apparent cause of suffering. But how shall we conceive of the elimination of pain from the nervous sensation or of death from the life of the body? Yet the rejection of pain is the sovereign instinct of the sensation, the rejection of death the dominant claim inherent in the essence of our vitality. But these things present themselves to our reason as instinctive aspiration, not as realizable potentiality. Yet the same law should hold throughout. The error of the practical reason is an excessive subjection to the apparent fact which it can immediately feel as real, and an insufficient courage in carrying profounder facts of potentiality to the logical conclusion. What is the realization of the anterior potentiality. Present potentiality is the clue to future realization, and here potentiality exists. For the mastery of phenomena depends upon a knowledge of the causes and process, and if we know the causes of error, sorrow, pain, death, we may labor with some hope towards their elimination, for knowledge is power and mastery. In fact, we do pursue as an ideal, so far as we may, the elimination of all these negative or adverse phenomena. We seek constantly to minimize the causes of error, pain, and suffering. Science, as its knowledge increases, dreams of regulating birth and of infinitely prolonging life. It is not of, if not of affecting the entire conquest of death, but because we envisage only the external or secondary causes, we can only think of removing them to a distance or not eliminating the actual roots of that against which we struggle. And we are thus limited because we strive towards secondary perception and not towards root knowledge. Or because we know process of things but not their essence. We thus arrive at a more powerful manipulation of circumstances, not at essential control. But if we grasp the essential nature and the essential causes of error, suffering and death, we might hope to arrive at a mastery over them which should not be relative but entire. We might hope even to eliminate them altogether and justify the dominant instinct of our nature by the conquest of that absolute good, blessed knowledge and immortality which our intuitions pursue as the true and ultimate condition of the human being. The ancient Veda presents us with a solution, such a solution in the conception and experience of Brahman as the one universal and essential fact of the nature of Brahmana Satchidananda. On this view, the essence of all life is the movement of a universal and immortal existence. The essence of all sensation and emotion is the play of a universal and self-existent delight and being. The essence of all thought and perception is the radiation of a universal and all-pervading truth. The essence of all activity is the progression of a universal self-affecting good. But a play, the movement embodies itself in a multiplicity of forms, a variation of tendencies, and interplay of energy. Multiplicity permits of the interference of a determinative and temporary deformative factor. The individual ego and the nature of the ego is a self-limitation of consciousness by a will, ignorance of the rest of its play, and is exclusive absorption in one form, one combination of tendencies, one field of movement of energies. Ego is the factor which determines the reactions of error, sorrow, pain, evil, death, for it gives these values of two movements which would otherwise be represented in the right relation to the one existence, of bliss, truth, and good. By recovering the right relation, we may eliminate the ego-determined reactions, reducing them eventually to their true values. And this recovery can be affected by the right participation of the individual in the consciousness of the totality and in the consciousness of the transcendent which the totality represents. Into later Vedanta, they are trapped and arrive at fixing the idea that the limited ego is not only the cause of the dualities, but the essential condition for the existence of the universe. By getting rid of the ignorance of the ego and its resultant limitation, we do indeed eliminate the dualities, but we eliminate along with them our existence in the cosmic movement. Thus, we return to the essentially evil and illusory nature of human existence and the vanity of all effort after perfection in the life of the world. A relative good linked always to its opposite is all that here we can see. But if we adhere to the larger and profounder idea, the ego is only an intermediate representation of something beyond itself. We escape from this consequence and are able to apply a Vedanta to fulfillment of life. And not only to the escape from life, the essential cause and condition of the universal existence of the Lord, Ishvara, Purusha, manifesting and occupying individual and universal forms. The limited ego is only an intermediate phenomenon of consciousness necessary for a certain line of development. Following this line, the individual can arrive at that which is beyond himself, that which he represents and can yet continue to represent it, no longer as an obscure and limited ego, but as the center of the divine and of the universal consciousness, embracing, utilizing and transforming into harmony with the divine all individual determination. We have then the manifestation of the divine conscious being in the totality of the physical nature, the foundation of the human existence in the material universe. We have the emergence of that conscious being in an involved and inevitably evolving life, mind and supermind as the condition of our activities. For it is this evolution which has enabled man to appear in matter, and it is this evolution which will enable him progressively to manifest God in the body, the universal incarnation. We have in the egoistic formation the intermediate and decisive factor which allows the man to emerge as the conscious mind out of death, indeterminate totality general, obscure and formless, which we call the subconscious, Hridaya Samudra, the ocean or in things of the Rig Veda. We have the dualities of life and death, joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, truth and error, good and evil, as the first formations of the egoistic consciousness, the natural and inevitable outcome of its attempt to realize unity in an artificial construction of itself exclusive of the true, total truth, good life, and delight of being in the universe. We have the dissolution of this egoistic construction by the self-opening of the individual to the universe and to God as a means of that supreme fulfillment to which egoistic life is only a prelude, even as animal life was only a prelude to the human. We have the realization of the all in the individual by the transformation of the limited ego into a conscious center of the divine unity and freedom as the term at which the fulfillment arrives. And we have the outflowing of the infinite and absolute existence, truth, good, and delight of being on the many in the world as the divine results towards which the cycles of our evolution move. This is the supreme birth which maternal her nature holds in herself. Of this she strives to be delivered. Now for the next chapter. The methods of the Vedantic knowledge. But what then is the working of the Satchidananda in the world, and by what process of things are the relations between itself and the ego which figures it first form, then led to their consummation? For on those relations and on the process they follow depend the whole philosophy and practice of a divine life for man. We are at the consummation of the knowledge of a divine existence by exceeding the evidence of the senses and piercing beyond the walls of the physical mind. So long as we confine ourselves to the sense evidence and the physical consciousness, we can consume nothing and know nothing except the material world and its phenomena. But certain faculties in us enable our mentality to arrive conception which we may indeed deduce by ratiocination or by imaginative variation from the facts of the physical world as we see them, but which are not warranted by any purely physical thought or any physical experience. The first of this instrument is the pure reason. Human reason has a double action, mixed or dependent, pure or sovereign. Reason accepts a mixed action when it confines itself to the circle of our sensible experience, admits its laws, the final truth, and concerns itself only with the study of phenomena, that is to say, with the appearances of things in their relations, processes, and utilities. This rational action is incapable of knowing what is. It only knows what appears to be. It has no plummet by which it can sound the depths of being. It can only survey the field of becoming reason. On the other hand, asserts its pure action. On accepting our sensible experiences as a starting point but refusing to be limited by them, it goes behind. As judges, works in its own right and strives to arrive at general and unalterable concepts which attach themselves not to the appearances of things but to that which stands behind their appearances. It may arrive at its result by direct judgment, passing immediately from the appearance to that which stands behind it, and in that case the concept arrived may seem to be a result of the sensible experience and dependent upon it, though it is really a perception of the reason working in its own right. But the perceptions of the pure reason may also, and this is their most characteristic action, use the experience from which they are stored as a mere excuse and leave it far behind before they arrive at the result, so far that the result may seem the direct contrary to that which our sensible experience wishes to dictate to us. This moment is legitimate and indispensable, because our normal experience not only covers only a small part of universal fact, but even in the limits of its own field uses instruments that are defective and uses false weights and measures. It must be exceeded, put away to a distance, and its insistences often denied. If we have to arrive at a more adequate conception of the truth of things, to correct the errors of the sense mind by the use of reason is one of the most valuable powers developed by man and the chief cause of his superiority among terrestrial beings. The complete use of pure reason brings us finally from physical to metaphysical knowledge, but the concepts of metaphysical knowledge do not in themselves fully satisfy the demand of our integral being. They are indeed entirely satisfactory to the pure reason itself, because they are the very stuff of its own existence. But our nature sees things through two eyes always, for it views them doubly as idea and as fact, and therefore every concept is incomplete for us and to part of our nature almost unreal until it becomes an experience. But the truths which are now in question are of an order not subject to our normal experience. They are, in their nature, beyond the perception of the senses but visible by the perception of the reason. Therefore, some other faculty of experience is necessary by which the demand of our nature can be fulfilled, and this can only come since we are dealing with the supraphysical by an extension of psychological experience. In a sense, all our experience is psychological, since even what we receive by the senses has no meaning or value to us, still it has translated into the terms of the sense mind. The manners of the Indian philosophical terminology, manas, say that our philosophers is the sixth sense, but we may even say that it is the only sense, and that the others, vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste, or merely specializations of the sense mind, which, although it normally uses the sense organs for the basis of its experience, yet exceeds them and is capable of a direct experience property its own inherent action as a result psychological experience. Like the cognition of the reason is capable in man of a double action, or mixed or dependent, pure or sovereign. Its mixed action takes place usually when the mind seeks to become aware of the external world, the object; the pure action when it seeks to become aware of itself, the subject. In the former activity, it is dependent on the senses and forms its perception in accordance with their evidence. In the latter, it acts in itself and is aware of the things dictated directly by a sort of identity with them. We are thus aware of our emotions. We are aware of our anger. We are aware of anger, as has been acutely said, because we become anger. We are thus aware also of our own existence. And here the nature of experience as knowledge by identity becomes apparent. In reality, all experience is in its secret nature knowledge by identity, but its true character is hidden from us, or because we have separated ourselves from the rest of the world by exclusion. But the distinction of ourselves as subject and everything else as object, and we are compelled to develop processes and organs by which we may again enter into the communion with all that we have excluded. We have to replace direct knowledge through conscious identity by an indirect knowledge which appears to be caused by physical contact and mental sympathy. This limitation is a fundamental creation of the ego and an instance of the manner in which it has proceeded throughout, starting from an original falsehood and covering over the truth of things by contingent falsehoods which become for us practical truths of relation. From this nature of mental and sense knowledge as it is at present organized in us, it follows that there is no inevitable necessity in our existing limitations. They are the result of an evolution in which mind has accustomed itself to depend upon some physiological functionings and the reactions to its normal means of entering into relation with the natural universe. And therefore, although it is a rule that when we seek to become aware of the external world, we have to do so indirectly through the sense organs and can experience only so much of the truth about things and man as the senses convey to us. Yet this rule is merely the regularity of a dominant habit. It is possible for the mind, and it would be natural for it if it could be persuaded to liberate itself from its consent to the domination of matter, to take direct cognizance of the object of sense without the aid of the sense organ. This is what happens in the experiments of hypnosis and cognitive psychological phenomena, because our waking consciousness is determined and limited by the balance of between mind and matter worked out by life in its evolution. This direct cognizance is usually impossible in our ordinary waking state and is therefore to be brought about by throwing of the waking mind in the state of sleep, which liberates the true or subliminal mind. Mind is then able to assert its true character as the one and all sufficient sense and free to apply to the object of sense. It's pure and sovereign instead of its mixed and dependent action. Nor is this extension of faculty really impossible, but only more difficult in our waking state, as is known to all who have been able to go far enough in certain parts of psychological experiment. The sovereign action of the sense mind can be employed to develop other senses developed which we ordinarily use. For instance, it is possible to develop the power of appreciating accurately with the physical means the weight of an object which we hold in our hands. Here, the sense of contact and pressure is merely used as a starting point, just as the data of sense experience are used by the pure reason. But it is not really the sense of touch which gives the measure of the weight to the mind, that finds the right value through its own independent perception and uses the touch only in order to enter into relation with the object. And as with the pure reason, so with the sense mind, the sense experience can be used as a mere first point from which it proceeds to a knowledge that has nothing to do with the sense organs and often contradicts their evidence. Nor is the extension of faculty confined only to the outsides and superficies. It is possible, once we have entered by any of the senses into relation with an external object, so to apply the manas as to become aware of the contents of the object. For example, to receive or to pursue the thoughts or feelings of others without aid from their utterance, gesture, action, or facial expression, and even in contradiction of this always partial and often misleading data. Finally, by any utilization of the inner senses, that is to say, of the sense powers in themselves, in their purely mental or subtle activity as distinguished from the physical, which is only a selection for the purposes of outward life from the total and general action. We are able to take cognition of sense experiences, of appearances, of images of things other than those which belong to the organization of our material environment. All these extensions of faculty, though received with hesitation and incredulity by the physical mind because they are abnormal to the habitual scheme of our ordinary life and experience, difficult to set in action, still more difficult to systemize as to be able to make them an orderly and serviceable set of instruments, must yet be admitted, since they are invariable results of any attempt to enlarge the field of a superficially active consciousness, whether by some kind of untaught effort and casual ill-ordered effect or by a scientific and well-regulated practice, or none of them, however, leads to the aim we have in view, the psychological experience of those truths that are beyond perception by the sense, but seizable by the perceptions of the reason, buddhi grahayam atindriyam. They give us only a larger field of phenomena and more effective means for the observation of phenomena. The truth of things always escapes beyond the sense. Yet is it a sound rule inherent in every constitution of the universe existence that words are closely attainable by this reason? There must be somewhere in the organism possessed of that reason a means of arriving at or verifying them by experience. The one means we have left in our mentality as in is an extension of that form of knowledge by identity which gives us the awareness of our own existence. It is really upon a self-awareness more or less conscient, more or less present in to our conception that the knowledge of the contents of our life is itself is based. Or to put in a more general formula, the knowledge of the contents is contained in the knowledge of the continent. If then we can extend our faculty of mental self-awareness to awareness of self beyond and outside us, Atman or Brahman of the Upanishads, we may become possessors in experience of the truths which form the contents of the Atman or Brahman in the universe. It is on this possibility that Indian Vedanta has based itself. It has sought through knowledge of the self, the knowledge of the universe. But always mental experience and concepts of the reason have been held to by it to be even at their highest a reflection in the mental identification, not the supreme existent identity. We have to go beyond the mind and the reason. The reason active in our waking consciousness only a mediator between the subconscious all that we come from in our evolution upwards and the superconscious all towards which we are impelled by that evolution. The subconscious and the superconscious are two different formulations of the same all. The master word of the subconscious is life, the master word of the superconscious is light. In the subconscious, knowledge of consciousness is involved in action, for action is the essence of life. In the superconscious, action re-enters into light and no longer contains involved knowledge but is itself contained in a supreme consciousness. Intuitional knowledge is that which is common between them, and the foundation of intuitional knowledge is conscious or effective identity between that which knows and that which is known. It is that state of common self-existence in which the knower and the known are one through knowledge. But in the subconscious and the intuition manifests itself in the action, in effectivity, and the knowledge of conscious identity is either entirely or more or less concealed in the action. In the superconscious, on the contrary, light being the law of the and the principle, the intuition manifests itself in its true nature as knowledge, emerging out of the conscious identity, and the effectivity of the action is rather the accompaniment of or necessary consequence and no longer masked as the primary fact. Between these two states of mind act as intermediaries which enable the being to liberate our knowledge out of its imprisonment in the act and prepare it to resume its essential primacy. When the self-awareness in the mind applied, both to continent and content, to own self and other self, exalts itself into the luminous self-manifest identity. The reason also converts itself into the form of a self-luminous intuitional knowledge. This is the highest possible state of our knowledge when mind fulfills itself in the supramental. Such is the scheme of human understanding upon which the conclusions of the most ancient Vedanta were built. To develop the results arrived on this foundation by the ancient sages is not my object, but it is necessary to pause briefly in review some of their principal conclusions, so far as they affect the problem of the divine life with which alone we are at present concerned. For it is in those ideas that we shall find the best previous foundation of that which we seek now to rebuild. And although, as with all knowledge, old expression has to be replaced to a certain extent by new expression suited to a later mentality, and old light has to emerge itself in a new light as dawn succeeds dawn. Yet it is with the old treasure as our initial capital, or so much of it as we can recover, that we shall more advantageously proceed to accumulate the larger gains in our new commerce with the ever-changeless and ever-changing infinite. Sat Brahman, experience pure, indefinable, infinite, absolute, is the last concept at which Vedantic analysis arrives in its view of the universe, the fundamental reality which Vedantic experience discovers behind all the movement and formation which constitute the apparent reality. It is obvious that when we possess this conception, we go entirely beyond what our ordinary consciousness, our normal experience contains or warrants. The senses and sense mind know nothing whatever about any pure or absolute existence. All that our sense experience tells us of is form and movement. Forms exist, but with an existence that is not pure, or rather always mixed, combined, aggregated, relative. When we go within ourselves, we may get rid of precise form, but we cannot get rid of movement, of change. Motion of matter in space, motion of change in time seems to be the condition of existence. We may say indeed, if you like, that this is existence, that and that the idea of existence in itself corresponds to no discoverable reality. At the most, in the phenomenon of self-awareness or behind it, we get sometimes a glimpse of something immovable, immutable, something that we vaguely pursue or imagine, that we are beyond all life and death, beyond all change and formation and action. There is the one door to in us that sometimes swings open upon the splendor of a truth beyond that. Before it shuts again, allows the ray to touch us, a luminous intimation which, if we have the strength and firmness, we may hold to in our faith and make a starting point for another play of consciousness than that of the sense mind for the play of intuition. For if we examine carefully, we shall find that the intuition is our first teacher. Intuition always stands real behind our mental operations. Intuition brings to man those brilliant messages from the unknown which are the beginning of his higher knowledge. Reason only comes in afterwards to see what profit it can have of the shining harvest. Intuition gives us the idea that something behind and beyond all that we know and seem to be, which pursues man always in contradiction of his lower reason and all his normal experience, and impels him to formulate that formless perception in the more positive ideas of God, immortality, heaven, and the rest by which we strive to express it to the mind. For intuition is as strong as nature itself, from whose very soul it has sprung, and cares nothing for the contradiction of reason or the denials of experience. It knows what is because it is, because itself is of that and has come from that, and will not yield it to the judgment of what merely becomes and appears. What the intuition tells us of is not so much existence as the existent. for it proceeds from one point of light in us which gives it its advantage that sometimes open door in our self-awareness. Ancient Vedanta sees this message of the intuition and formulated in the three great declarations of the Upanishads. I am me, thou art that, O Svetaketu. All this is the Brahman. This self is the Brahman. But intuition, by the very nature of his action in man, walking as it does from behind the wheel, active principally in his more unenlightened, less articulate parts, served in front of the wheel, in the narrow light which is our waking conscience, only by instruments that are unable fully to assimilate its messages. Intuition is unable to give us the truth in that order and articulated form which our nature demands. Before it could affect any such completeness of direct knowledge in us, it would have to organize itself in our surface being and take position thereof the leading part. But in our surface being, it is not the intuition, it is the reason which is organized and helps us to order our perceptions, thoughts, and actions. Therefore, the age of intuitive knowledge, represented by the early Vedantic thinking of the Upanishads, had a due place to the age of rational knowledge. Inspired scripture made room for metaphysical philosophy, even as afterwards metaphysical philosophy had to give place to experimental science. Intuitive thought, which is a messenger from the superconscious and therefore our highest faculty, was supplanted by the pure reason, which is only a sort of deputy and belongs to the middle heights of our being. Pure reason in its turn was supplanted for the time by the mixed action of the reason, which lives on our planes and lower elevations and does not in its view exceed the horizon of the experience, that the physical mind and senses are such age as we can invent for them can bring to us. And this process, which seems to be a descent, is really a circle of progress. For in each case, the lower faculty is compelled to take up as much as it can assimilate of what the higher had already given and to attempt to re-establish it by its own methods. By the attempt, it is itself enlarged in its scope and arrives eventually at a more supple and more ample self-accommodation to the higher faculties. Without this succession and attempt at separate assimilation, we should be obliged to remain under the exclusive domination of a part of our nature, while the rest remained either depressed and unduly subjected or separate in its field and therefore poor in its development. With this succession and separate attempt, the balance is righted, a more complete harmony of the paths of knowledge is prepared. We see this action in the Upanishads and subsequent Indian philosophies. The sages of the Veda and Vedanta relied entirely upon intuition and spiritual experience. It is by an error that scholars sometimes speak of the great debates or discussion in the Upanishad. Wherever there is the appearance of a controversy, it is not by discussion, by dialectics or the use of logical reasoning that it proceeds, but by a comparison of intuition and experiences with the less luminous gives place to the more luminous, the narrower, faultier, or less essential to the more comprehensive, more perfect, more essential. The question asked by one sage of another is what dost thou know, not what dost thou think, nor to what condition has thy reasoning arrived. Nowhere in the Upanishads do you find any trace of logical reasoning urged in support of the truths of Vedanta. Intuition, the sages seem to avail, must be corrected by a more perfect intuition. Logical reasoning cannot be its judge, and yet the human reason demands its own method of satisfaction. Therefore, when the age of rationalistic speculation began, Indian philosophers, respectful of the heritage of the past, adopted a double attitude towards the truth they sought. They recognize in the Shruti the earlier results of the intuition, or, as they prefer to call it, of inspired revelation and authority superior to reason. But at the same time, they started from reason and tested the results it gave them, holding only those conclusions to be valid which were supported by the supreme authority. In this way, they avoided to a certain extent the besetting sin of metaphysics, the tendency to battle in the clouds because it deals with words as if they were imperative facts instead of symbols which have always to be carefully scrutinized and brought back constantly to the sense of that which they represent. Their speculations tended at first to keep near at the center of the highest and profoundest experience and proceeded to the united concept of the two great authorities, reason and intuition. Nevertheless, the natural trend of reason to assert its own supremacy triumphed in effect over the theory of the subordination. Hence, the rise of conflicting schools, each of which founded itself in theory of the Veda and used its text as a weapon against the others, for the highest intuitive knowledge sees things in the whole, in the large, and details only as the sights of the indivisible whole. Its tendency is towards immediate synthesis and unity of knowledge. Reason, on the contrary, proceeds by analysis and division and assembles facts to form a whole. But in the assemblage so formed, there are opposites, anomalies, logical incompatibilities, and the natural tendency of reason is to affirm some and to negate others which conflict with its chosen conclusion, so that it may form a flawlessly logical system. The unity of the first intuitional knowledge was thus broken up, and the ingenuity of the logicians was always able to discover devices, methods of interpretation, standards of varying value by which inconvenient texts of the scriptures could be practically annulled, and an entire freedom appeared for the metaphysical speculation. And nevertheless, the mind conceptions of the earlier Vedanta remained in pause in the various philosophical systems, and efforts were made from time to time to recombine them into some image of the world Catholicity, and unity of intuitional thought, and behind the thought of all, variously presented, survived as a fundamental conception, Purusha, Atman, or Sat Brahman, the pure existence of the Upanishads, often rationalized into an idea or psychological state, but still carrying something of its old burden of inexpressible reality. What may be the relation of the movement of becoming, which is what we call the world, to this absolute unity, and how the ego, was it generated by the movement or causes of the movement, can return to that true self, divinity or reality declared by the Vedanta? These were the questions, speculative or practical, which have always occupied the thought of India. Look to the next chapter, pure existence. One will throw a place from its egoistic preoccupation with the limited and fleeting interest and look upon the world with passionate and curious eyes that search only for the truth. Our first result is the perception of a boundless energy of infinite existence, infinite movement, infinite activity, pouring itself out of limitless space. Or limitless space, in eternal time, an existence that surpasses infinitely our ego or any collectivity of egos, in whose balance the grandiose products of eons are but the dust of a moment, and in whose incalculable sum, some numberless myriads count only as petty swam. We instinctively act and feel and view our life thoughts as if this stupendous world movement were at work around us as center and for our benefit, for our help or harm, or as if the justification of our egoistic cravings, emotions, ideas, standards for its proper business, even as they are our own chief concern. One we begin to say we perceive the idea exists for itself, not for us, as its own gigantic aims, its own complex and boundless idea, its own vast desire or delight that is it should fulfill, its own immense and formidable standards, which look down as if with an indulgent and ironic smile at the pettiness of ours. And yet, let us not swing over to the other extreme and form too positive an idea of our own insignificance. That would be an act of ignorance and the shutting of our eyes to the great facts of the universe. For this boundless movement does not regard us as unimportant to it. Science reveals to us how minute is the care, how cunning the device, how intense the absorption. It bestows upon the smallest of its work, even as on the largest. This mighty energy is unequal and impartial mother, Samam Brahma, in the great term of the Gita, and its intensity and force of movement is the same in the formation and upholding of systems of sense and the organization of the life of an ant-hill. It is the illusion of size of quantity that induces us to look on the one as great, the other as petty. Or look on if you look on the contrary, not at the mass of quantity but the force of quality, we shall say that the ant is greater than the solar system, it inhabits, and the man greater than all inanimate nature put together. But this again is the illusion of quality. When we go behind and examine only the intensity of the movement of which quality and quantity are aspect, we realize that this Brahman dwells equally in all existences, equally partaken of by all in its being. We are tempted to say equally distributed to all in its energy, but this too is an illusion of quantity. Brahman dwells in all, indivisible, yet as if divided and distributed. If you look again with an observing perception not dominated by intellectual concept, but informed by intuition and culminating in knowledge by identity, we shall see that the consciousness of this infinite energy is other than our mental consciousness, that it is indivisible and gives not an equal part of itself, but its whole self at one and the same time to the solar system and to the anthill. To Brahman there are no whole and parts, but each thing is all itself and benefits by the whole of Brahman. Quality and quantity differ. The self is equal. The form and manner and result of the force of action vary infinitely, but the eternal, primal, infinite energy is the same in all. The force of strength that goes to make the strong man is no whit greater than the force of weakness that goes to make the weak. The energy spent is as great in repression as in expression, in negation as in affirmation, in silence as in song. Therefore, the first reckoning we have to demand is that between this infinite moment, this energy of existence is the world and ourselves. At present, we keep a false account. We are infinitely important to the all, but to us, the all is negligible. We alone are important to ourselves. This is a sign of original ignorance, which is the root of the ego, that it can only think of with itself as a center, as if it were the all, and of that which is not itself accepts only so much as it is mentally disposed to acknowledge, or as it is forced to recognize by the shocks of its environment. Even when it begins to philosophize, does it not assert that the world only exists in and its conscious and by its consciousness, its own state of consciousness or mental standards, or to it the test of reality? All outside its orbit or view tends to become false or non-existent. This mental self-sufficiency of man creates a system of false accountancy which prevents us from drawing the right and full value from life. There is a sense in which this pretension of the human mind and ego repose on a truth. But this truth only emerges when the mind has learned its ignorance and the ego has submitted to the all and lost in its separate self-realization. To recognize that we, or rather the results and appearances we call ourselves, are only a partial moment of this infinite moment, and that it is that infinite which we have to know, to be consciously and to fulfill faithfully, is a commencement of a true living. To recognize that in our true selves we are one with the total movement and not minor or subordinate is the other side of the account, and his expression is the manner of our being. Thought, emotion, and action is necessary to the culmination of a true or divine living. But to settle the account, we have to know that what is this all? this infinite and omnipotent energy. And here we come to a fresh complication, for it is asserted to us by the pure reason, and it seems to be asserted to us by Vedanta, that as pure subject, subordinate, and an aspect of this movement, so the movement is a subordinate and an aspect of something other than itself, of a great timeless, spaceless stability, stanu, which is immutable, inexhaustible, and unexpended, not acting though containing all this action, not energy but pure existence. Those who see only the world energy can declare indeed that there is no such thing. Our idea of an eternal stability and immutable pure existence is a fiction of our intellectual conception, starting from a false idea of the stable. For there is nothing that is stable. All is movement, and our conception of the stable is only an artifice of our mental consciousness by which we secure a standpoint for dealing practically with the movement. It is easy to show that this is true in the movement itself. There is nothing that is stable. All that appears to be stationary is only a block of movement, a formulation of energy at work which so affects our consciousness that it seems to be still, somewhat as the earth seems to us to be still, somewhat as the strain in which you are traveling seems to be still in the midst of a rushing landscape. But is it equally true that the underlying movement supporting it, there is nothing that is more or less than immutable? Is it true that the existence consists only in the action of energy? Or is it not rather that the energy is an output of existence? We see at once that if such an existence is, that it must be like the energy infinite. Neither reason or experience or intuition or imagination bears witness to us of the possibility of a final terminus. All end and beginning presuppose something beyond the end or beginning. An absolute end, an absolute beginning is not only a contradiction in terms, but a contradiction of the essence of things, a violence, a fiction. Infinity imposes itself upon the appearances of the finite by its inevitable self-existence. But this is infinity with regard to time and space, an eternal duration, interminable extension. The pure reason goes further, and looking in its own a colorless and austere light at time and space points out that these two are categories of our consciousness, conditions under which we arrange our perception of phenomena. When we look at existence in itself, time and space disappear. If there is an extension, it is not a spatial but a psychological extension. If there is any duration, it is not a temporal but a psychological duration. But it is then easy to see that this extension and duration are only symbols which represent to the mind something not translatable into intellectual terms. And eternity which seems to us the same, all containing ever new moment. Or an infinity which seems to us the same, all containing, all pervading point without magnitude. And this conflict of terms, so violent yet accurately expressive of something we do pursue, shows that the mind and speech have passed beyond their natural limits and are striving to express the reality in which their own conventions and necessary oppositions disappear into an ineffable identity. But is this a true record? May it not be that time and space so disappear merely because the existence we are regarding is a fiction of the intellect, a fantastic nihil created by speech, which we strive to erect into a conceptual reality? We regard again that the existence in itself, and we say, no, there is something behind the phenomenon, not only infinite but indefinable, of no phenomenon, of no totality of phenomena. Can we say that absolutely it is? Even if we reduce all phenomena to one fundamental, universal, irreducible phenomenon of movement or energy, we get only an indefinable phenomenon. The very concept of movement carries with it the potentiality of repose and betrays itself as an activity of some existence. The very idea of energy in action carries with it the idea of energy abstaining from action, and an absolute energy not in action is simply and purely absolute existence. We have only these two alternatives, either an indefinable pure existence or an indefinable energy in action, and if the latter alone is true, without any stable base or cause, then the energy is the resultant phenomenon generated by the action. The moment which alone is, we have then no existence. Or we have the nihil of the Buddhism, which existence as only an attribute of an eternal phenomenon of action, of karma, of movement. This, asserts the pure reason, leaves my perceptions unsatisfied, contradicts my fundamental seeing, and therefore cannot be. For it brings us to the last abruptly ceasing stair of an ascent which leaves the whole staircase without support, suspended in the void. If this indefinable, infinite, timeless, spaceless existence is, it is necessarily a pure absolute. It cannot be summed up in any quantity or quantities. It cannot be composed of any quality or combination of qualities. It is not an aggregate of forms or a formal substratum of forms. If all forms, quantities, qualities were to disappear, this would remain. Existence without quantity, without quality, without form is not only conceivable, but it is the one thing we can conceive behind this phenomena. Necessarily, when we say it is without them, we mean that it exists them. That it is something into which they pass in such a way as to cease to be what we call form, quality, quantity, and all of which they emerge as form, quality, and quantity in the moment. They do not pass away into one form, one quality, one quantity, which is the basis of all the rest, for there is none such, but into something which cannot be defined by any of these terms. So, all things that are conditions and appearances of the moment pass into that form, that from which they have come, and that so far as they exist. become something that can no longer be described by the terms that are appropriate to them in the moment. Therefore, we say that the pure existence is absolute and in itself unknowable by our thought, although we can go back to it in supreme identity that transcends the terms of knowledge. The moment, on the contrary, is the field of the relative, and yet, by the very definition of the relative, all things in the moment contain, or contain in, and or the absolute. The relation of the phenomenon of nature to the fundamental other, which is contained in them, constitutes them, contains them, and yet is so different from the that entering into it is they cease to be what they know are is the illustration given by the Vedanta as most nearly representing this identity in difference between the absolute and the relative. Necessarily, when we speak of things passing to from which they come, we are using the language of our temporal consciousness and must guard ourselves against its illusions. The emergence of the moment from the immutable is an eternal phenomenon, and it's only because we cannot conceive it in that beginningless, endless, ever new moment, which is the eternity of the timeless, that our notions and perceptions are compelled to place it in a temporal eternity of successive duration to which are attached the ideas of an always recurrent beginning, middle, and end. But all this, it may be said, is valid only so long as we accept the concepts of pure reason and remain subject to them. But the concept of reason have no obligatory force. We must judge of existence not by what we mentally conceive, but by what we see to exist. And the purest, freest form of insight into existence as it is shows us nothing but movement. Two things alone exist: movement in space, movement in time. The former objective, the latter subjective. Extension is real. Extension is real, duration is real, space and time are real. Even if we can go behind extension in space and perceive it as a psychological phenomenon, as an attempt of the mind to make existence manageable by distributing the indivisible whole in a conceptual space, yet we cannot go behind the movement of succession and change in time, for that is the very stuff of our consciousness. We are and the world is a movement that continually progresses and increases by the inclusion of all the successions of the past as a present, which represents itself to us as the beginning of all the succession of future, a beginning, a present that always eludes us because it is not, for it has perished before it is born. What is the eternal, indivisible succession of time carrying on its stream, a progressive movement of consciousness also indivisible. Duration then, eternally, successive movement and change in time is the sole absolute, becoming is the sole being. In reality, this opposition of actual insight into being to the conceptual fictions of the pure reason is fallacious. If indeed intuition in this matter were really opposed to intelligence, we could not confidently support a merely conceptual reasoning against fundamental insight. But this appeal to intuitive experience is incomplete. It is valid only so far as it proceeds and it errs by stopping short of the integral experience. So long as the intuition fixes itself upon that which we become, we see ourselves as a continual progression of movement and change in consciousness in the eternal succession of time. We are the river, the flame of the Buddhist illustration, but that is the supreme experience and its supreme intuition by which we go back behind our surface self and find that this becoming, change, succession are only a mode of our being, and that there is that in us which is not involved at all in the becoming. Not only can we have the intuition of this that is stable and eternal in us, not only can we have the glimpse of it in experience behind the veil of continually fleeting becomings, but we can draw back into it and live in it entirely, so affecting an entire change in our external life and in our attitude and in our action upon the movement of the world. And the stability in which we can so live is precisely that which the pure reason has already given us. Although it can be arrived at without reasoning at all, without knowing previously what it is pure existence, eternal, infinite, indefinable, not affected by the succession of time, not involved in the extension of space, beyond form, quantity, quality, self, only, and absolute. The pure existence is then a fact and no mere concept. It is a fundamental reality, but let us hasten to add the movement, the energy, the becoming are also a fact, also a reality. The supreme intuition and its corresponding experience may correct the other, may go beyond, may suspend, but do not abolish it. We have therefore two fundamental facts of pure existence and of world existence, a fact of being, a fact of becoming. To deny one or the other is easy. To recognize the facts of consciousness and to find out their relation is the true and fruitful wisdom. Stability and movement, we must remember, are only our psychological representations of the absolute, given as our oneness and multitude. The absolute is beyond stability and movement as it is beyond unity and multiplicity, but it takes its eternal poise in the one and the stable and the will surround itself infinitely, inconceivably, securely in the moving and multitudinous. A world existence is the ecstatic dance of Shiva which multiplies the body of the god numberlessly to the view. It lives that white existence precisely where and what it was, ever is and ever will be. Its sole absolute object is the joy of the dancing. But as we cannot describe or think of the absolute in itself, beyond stability and movement, beyond unity and multitude, nor is that all our business. We must accept the double fact, admit both Shiva and Kali, and seek to know what is this measureless movement in time and space. With regard to that timeless and spaceless pure existence, of one unstable to which measure and measurelessness are inapplicable, or have seen what pure reason, intuition, and experience have to say about pure existence, about self, what have they to say about force, about movement, about Shakti. And the first thing we have to ask ourselves is whether that force, simply an unintelligent energy of movement, or whether the consciousness which seems to emerge out of it in this material world we live in is not merely one of its phenomenal results, but rather its own true and secret nature. In Vedantic terms, is force simply Prakriti, only a movement of action and process, or is Prakriti a really power of chits in its nature force of creative self-conscious conscience? On this essential problem, all the rest hinges. So, the next chapter, conscious force. All phenomenal existence resolves itself into first a moment of energy that assumes more or less material, more or less grass, and subtle forms for self-presentation to its own experience. Of the ancient images by which human thought attempted to make this original law of being intelligible and real to itself, this infinite existence of force was figured as the sea initially at rest and therefore free from forms. But the first disturbance, the first initiation of movement necessitates the creation of forms and is the seed of a universe. A matter is a presentation of force which is most as easily intelligible to our intelligence, molded as it is by contacts in matter, to which a mind involved in material brain gives the response. The elementary state of material force is, in the view of the old Indian physicists, a condition of pure material extension in space of which the peculiar properties is vibration, typified to us by the phenomenon of sound. But vibration in this state of weather is not sufficient to create form. There must be some obstruction in the flow of force ocean, some contraction and expansion, some interplay of vibration, some impinging of force upon force so as to create a beginning of fixed relations and mutual effects. Material force modifying its first ethereal status assumes a second, called in the world language the aerial, of which the special property is contact between force and force. Contact that is the basis of all material relations. Still we have not as a real forms but only varying forces. A sustaining principle is needed. This is provided by a third self-modification of the primitive force of which the principle of light, electricity, fire and heat is for us the characteristic manifestation. Even then, we can have forms of force preserving their own character and peculiar action, but not stable forms of matter. A fourth state characterized by division and a first medium of permanent attraction and repulsions, termed picturesquely water or the liquid state, and a fifth of cohesion, termed earth or the solid state, complete the necessary elements. All forms of matter of which we are aware, all physical things, even to the most subtle, are built up by the combination of these five elements. Upon them also depends all our sensible experience. For by the reception of vibration comes the sense of sound. By contact of things in a world of vibration of force, the sense of touch. By the action of light in the forms outlined, sustained by the force of light and fire and heat, the sense of sight. By the fourth element, the sense of taste. By the fifth, the sense of smell. All is essentially response to vibratory contact between force and force. In this way, the ancient thinkers bridge the gulf between pure force and its final modifications and satisfy the difficulty which prevents the ordinary human mind from understanding how all these forms which are to his senses so real, solid and durable can be in truth only temporary phenomena and a thing like pure energy. To the senses, non-existent, intangible and almost incredible, can be the one permanent cosmic reality. The problem of consciousness is not solved by this theory, for it does not explain how the contact of vibration of force should give rise to conscious sensations. The Sankhyas or analytic thinkers posited therefore behind these five elements two principles which they call Mahat and Ahankara, principles which are really non-material. For the first is nothing but the vast cosmic principle of force, and the other the divisional principle of the ego formation. Nevertheless, these two principles, as also the principle of intelligence, becomes active in consciousness not by virtue of force itself but by virtue of an inactive conscious soul or souls in which its activities are reflected, and by that reflection assume the hue of consciousness. As such is the explanation of things offered by the school of Indian philosophy, which comes nearer to the modern materialistic ideas and which carry the idea of mechanical or unconscious force in nature as far as was possible to seriously reflective Indian mind. Whatever its defects, its mind idea was so indisputable that it came to be generally accepted. However, the phenomenon of consciousness may be explained. Whether nature be an inert impulse or a conscious principle, it is certainly force. The principle of things is a formative movement of energies. All forms are born of mating and mutual adaptation between unshaped forces. All sensation and action is the response of something in a form of force to the contacts of other forms of force. And this is the world as we experience it, and from this experience we must always strive. Physical analysis of matter by modern science has come to the same general conclusion. Even if a few lost doubts still linger, intuition and experience confirm this concord of science and philosophy. Pure reason finds in it the satisfaction of its own essential conception. For even in the view of the world as essential an act of consciousness, an act is implied and in the act movement of force, play of energy. This also, when we examine from within our own experience, proves to be the fundamental nature of the world. All our activities are the play of the triple force of the world philosophies: knowledge force, desire force, action force, and all this prove to be really three streams of one original and identical power, Adya Shakti. Even our states of rest are only equable state or equilibrium of the play of our movement. Movement of force being admitted as the whole nature of the cosmos. Two questions arise. And first, how did this movement come to take place at all in the bosom of the existence? If you suppose it to be not only eternal, but the very essence of all existence, the question does not arise. But we have negative this theory. We are aware of an existence which is not compelled by the moment. How then does this movement, alien to its eternal repose, come to take place in it? By what cause, by what possibility, by what mysterious impulsion? The answer most approved by the ancient Indian mind was that force is inherent in existence. Shiva and Kali, Brahman and Shakti are one and not two, who are separable. Force inherent in existence may be at rest or it may be in motion. But when it is at rest, it exists nonetheless and is not abolished, diminished, or in any way essentially altered. This reply is so entirely rational and in accordance with the nature of things that we need not hesitate to accept it, for it is impossible, because contradictory of reason, to suppose that the force is a thing alien to the one and infinite existence and entered into it from outside, or was a non-existence and arose in it at some point of time. Even the illusionist theory must admit that Maya, the power of self-illusion in Brahman, is potentially eternal being. And then the sole question is its manifestation or non-manifestation. The Sankhya also says the eternal coexistence of Prakriti and Purusha, nature and conscious soul, and the alternative state of rest of or equilibrium of Prakriti and movement or disturbance of equilibrium. But since force is thus inherent in existence, and it is the nature of force to have this double or alternative potentiality of rest and movement, and that is to say, of self-concentration in force and self-division in force, the question of the how of the movement, its possibility, initiating compulsion or impelling cause does not arise, for we can easily then conclude that this potentiality must translate itself either as an alternative rhythm of rest and movement succeeding each other in time, or else as an eternal self-concentration of force in immutable existence with a superficial play of movement, change and formation like the rising and falling of waves on the surface of the ocean. And the superficial play, we are naturally speaking in inadequate images, may be either coival with self-concentration and itself also eternal, or it may begin and end in time and be resumed by a sort of constant rhythm. It is then not eternal in continuity but eternal in recurrence. The problem of the how thus eliminated. That presents itself the question of the why. Why should this possibility of a play of movement of force translate itself at all? Why should not force of existence remain eternally considered in itself, infinite, free from all variations and formation? This question also does not arise if we assume existence to be a non-conscious and consciousness only as a development of material energy which we wrongly suppose to be immaterial. For then we can say simply that this rhythm is the nature of force in existence, and there is absolutely no reason to seek for a why, a cause, an initial motive, or a final purpose for that which is its native, which is in its nature eternally self-existent. We cannot put that question to eternal self-existence and ask it whether either why it exists or how it came into existence. Neither can we put it to self-force of existence and its inherent nature of impulsion to movement. All that we can inquire into is its manner of self-manifestation, its principles of movement and formation, its process of evolution, both existence and force being inert status and inert impulsion, both of them unconscious and unintelligent. There cannot be any purpose or final goal in evolution or any original cause or intention. But if we suppose or find existence to be conscious being, the problem arises. We may indeed suppose a conscious being which is subject to its nature of force, compelled by it and without option as to whether it shall manifest in the universe or remain unmanifest. Such is the cosmic God. of the Tantrika and the Mayavadins who is subject to Shakti or Maya, Purusha involved in Maya or controlled by Shakti. But it is obvious that such a God is not the supreme infinite existence with which we have started. Admittedly, it is only a formulation of Brahman in the cosmos by the Brahman, which is itself logically anterior to Shakti or Maya and takes her back into its transcendental being once she ceases from her works. In a conscious existence which is absolute, independent of its formations, not determined by its works, one must suppose an inherent freedom to manifest or not to manifest the potentiality of movement. A Brahman compelled by Prakriti is not Brahman, but an inert infinite with an active content in it more powerful than the continent. A conscious holder of force, of whom is force is master. If we say that it is compelled by itself as force, by its own nature, we do not get rid of the contradiction. The evasion of our first postulate we have got back to an existence which is really nothing but force, force at rest having moment, absolute force perhaps, but not absolute being. It is unnecessary to examine into the relations between force and consciousness, but what do we mean by the latter? So ordinarily we mean it. Ordinarily we mean by the first obvious idea of a mental waking consciousness such as is possessed by the human being during the major part of his bodily existence. One is not asleep, stunned or otherwise deprived of his physical and superficial methods of sensation. In this sense, it is plain enough that consciousness is the exception and not the rule in the order of the material universe. We ourselves do not always possess it, but this vulgar and shallow idea of the nature of consciousness, though it still colors our ordinary thought and association, must now definitely disappear out of philosophical thinking. For we know that there is something in us which is conscious when we sleep, when we are stunned or dragged, or in a swoon, in all apparently unconscious states of a physical being. Not only so, but we may not be sure that the old thinkers were right when they declared that even in our waking state, what we call then our consciousness is only a small selection from our entire conscious being. It is a superficies. It is not even the whole of our mentality. Behind it, much vaster than it, there is a subliminal or subconscious mind which is the greater part of ourselves and contains heights and profundities which no man has yet measured or fathomed. This knowledge gives us a starting point for the true science of force and its workings. It delivers us definitely from circumscription by the material and from the illusion of the obvious. Materialism indeed insists that whatever the extension of consciousness, it is a material phenomenon inseparable from our physical organs and not their utilizer but the result. This orthodox contention, however, is no longer able to hold the field against the tide of increasing knowledge. Its explanations are becoming more and more inadequate and strained. It is becoming always clearer that not only does the capacity of our total consciousness far exceed that of our organs, the senses, the nerves, the brain, but that even our ordinary thought and consciousness, these organs are only their habitual instruments and not their generators. Consciousness uses the brain, which its outward strivings have produced. Brain has not produced, nor does it use the consciousness. There are even abnormal instances which go to prove that our organs are not entirely indispensable instruments, that the heartbeats are not absolutely essential to life any more than is breathing, nor the organized brain cells to thought. Our physical organism no more causes or explains thought and consciousness than the construction of an engine causes or explains the motive power of steam or electricity. The force is anterior, not the physical instrument. Momentous logical consequences follow. In the first place, we may ask whether, since even mental consciousness exists where we say inanimation and inertia, it is not possible that even in material objects a universal subconscious mind is present although unable to act or communicate itself to its surface for want of organs. Is the material state an emptiness of consciousness, or is it not rather only a sleep of consciousness, even though from the point of view of evolution an original and not an intermediate sleep? And by the sleep the human example teaches us that we not mean not a suspension of consciousness but is gathering inward away from conscious physical response to the impacts of external things, and is not this what all existence is that has not yet developed means of outward communication with the external physical world? Is there not a conscious soul, a Purusha who wakes forever, even in all that sleeps? We may go further. One will speak of subconscious man. We should mean by the phrase a thing not different from the outer mentality, but only acting below the surface, unknown to the waking man. In the same sense, if perhaps with a deeper plans and a larger scope, but the phenomenon of the subliminal self far exceeds the limits of any such definition. It includes an action not only immensely superior in capacity, but quite different in kind from what we know as mentality in our waking self. We have therefore a right to suppose that there is subconscious in us as well as a subconscious, a range of conscious faculties, and therefore an organization of consciousness which rise high above that psychological stratum to which we give the name of mentality. And since the subliminal self in us thus rises in superconscious above mentality, may it not also sink in subconscious below mentality? Or there not in us and in the world forms of consciousness which are submental, to which we can give the name of vital and physical consciousness? If so, we must suppose in the plant and the metal also a force to which we can give the name of consciousness, although it is not the human or animal mentality for which we have hitherto preserved the monopoly of that description. Not only is this probable, but if we consider things dispassionately, it is certain in ourselves there is such a vital consciousness which acts in the cells of the body and the automatic vital functions, so that we go through purposeful movements and obey attractions and repulsions to which our mind is a stranger. In animals, this vital consciousness is an even more important factor. In plants, it is intuitively evident. The seekings and shrinkings of the plant, its pleasure and pain, its sleep and its wakefulness, and all that strange life whose truth an Indian scientist has brought to light by rigidly scientific methods, are all movements of consciousness. But as far as we can see, not of mentality. That is then a submental, a vital consciousness which has precisely the same initial reactions as the mental, but is different in the constitution of its self-experience, even as that which is superconscious is in the constitution of its self-experience different from the mental being. Does the range of what we call consciousness cease with the plant, with that in which we recognize the existence of a sub-animal life? If so, we must then suppose that there is a force of life and consciousness originally alien to matter which has yet entered into unoccupied matter, perhaps from another world, for whence otherwise can it have come. The ancient thinkers believed in the existence of such worlds which perhaps sustain life and consciousness in ours, or even call it out by their pressure, but do not create it by their entry. Nothing can evolve out of matter which is not therein contained. But there is no reason to suppose that the gamut of life and consciousness fails and stops short in that which seems to us purely material. The development of recent research and thought seems to point to a sort of obscure beginning of life and perhaps a sort of inert or suppressed consciousness in the metal and in the earth, and the other inanimate forms are at least the first stuff of what becomes consciousness in us may be there. Only while in the plant we can dimly recognize and conceive the thing that I have called vital consciousness. The consciousness of matter, of the inert form, is difficult indeed for us to understand or imagine, and what we find is difficult to understand or imagine, we consider it our right to deny. Nevertheless, when one has pursued consciousness so far into the depths, it becomes incredible that there should be this sudden gulf in nature. Thought has the right to suppose. Thought has the right to suppose the unity where that unity is confessed by all the other classes of phenomena in one class only, and in one class only, not denied, but merely more concealed than in others. And if we suppose that unity to be unbroken, we then arrive at the existence of consciousness in all forms of the force which is at work in the world. Even if there be no conscient or superconscient Purusha inhabiting all forms, yet is there in those forms a conscious force of being of which even the outer parts overtly or inertly partake. Well, normally, in such a view, the world consciousness is meaning its changes its meaning. It is no longer synonymous with mentality but indicates a self aware force of existence of which mentality is a middle term. A below mentality it sinks into vital and material movements which are for us subconscious. Above it rises into the supramental which is for us superconscious. But in all it is one and the same thing organizing itself differently. This is once more the Indian conception of Chit which as energy creates the world. So essentially we arrive at that unity which materialistic science persists from the other end. One it asserts that mind cannot be another force than matter but must be merely development and outcome of material energy. Indian thought at its deepest affirms on the other hand that mind and matter are rather different grades of the same energy, different organization of one conscious force of existence. But what right have we to assume consciousness as a just description for this force? For consciousness implies some kind of intelligence, purposefulness, self-knowledge, even though they may not take the form habitual to our mentality. Even from this point of view, everything supports rather than contradicts the idea of a universal conscious force. We see, for instance, in the animal operations of a perfect purposefulness, and an exact, indeed, a scientifically minute knowledge which are quite beyond the capacities of the animal mentality and which man himself can only acquire by long culture and education and even then uses with a much less sure rapidity. We are entitled to see in this general fact the proof of a conscious force at work in the animal and the insect which is more intelligent, more purposeful, more aware of its intention, its ends, its means, its conditions than the highest mentality, yet manifested in any individual form on earth. And in the operations of inanimate nature, we find the same pervading characteristic of supreme hidden intelligence, hidden in the modes of its own workings. The only argument against a conscious and intelligent source for this purposeful work, this work of intelligence, of selection, adaptation, and seeking, is that large element in nature's operations to which we give the name of waste. But obviously, this is an objection based on the limitations of our human intellect, which seeks to impose its own peculiar rationality, good enough for limited human ends, on the general operations of the world force. We see only a part of nature's purpose, and all that does not subserve that part we call waste. Yet, even our own human action is full of an apparent waste, so appearing from the individual point of view, which yet we may be sure subserves well enough the large and universal purpose of things, that part of our intention which we can detect. Nature gets done surely enough in spite of, perhaps really by virtue of her apparent waste. We may well trust to her in the rest which we do not yet detect. For the rest, it is impossible to ignore the drive of said purpose, the guidance of apparent blind tendency, the sure eventual or immediate coming to the target sought, which characterize the operations of world force in the animal, in the plant, in inanimate things. So long as the matter was alpha and omega to the scientific mind, the reluctance to admit intelligence as the mother of intelligence was an honest couple. But now it is no more than an outworn paradox to affirm the emergence of human consciousness, intelligence and mastery out of an unintelligent, blindly driving unconsciousness in which no form or substance of the previously existed. A man's consciousness can be nothing else than a form of nature's consciousness. It is there in other involved form below mind. It emerges in mind. It shall ascend into yet superior forms beyond mind. For that force that builds the worlds is a conscious force. The existence which manifests itself in them is conscious being, and a perfect emergence of its potentialities in the form is the sole object which we can rationally conceive for its manifestation of this world of forms. Next chapter, the world of existence, the problem. But even if you accept this pure existence, this Brahman, this Sat as the absolute beginning, the end, and continent of things, and in Brahman an inherent self-consciousness inseparable from its being and throwing itself out as a force of movement of consciousness, or which is creative of force, forms and worlds. We await no answer to the question, why should Brahman, perfect, absolute, infinite, and needing nothing, desiring nothing, at all throw out force of consciousness to create in itself these worlds of forms? For we have put aside the solution that it is compelled by its own nature of force to create, obliged by its own potentiality of movement and formation to move into forms. It is true that it has thus potentiality, but is not limited, bound or compelled by it. It is free, if, then, being free to move or remain eternally still, to throw itself into forms or retain the potentiality of form in itself, it indulges its power of movement and formation. It can be only for one reason, for delight. This primary, ultimate, and eternal existence, as seen by the Vedantins, is not merely bare existence or a conscious existence with consciousness as brute force or power. It is a conscious existence, the very term of whose being, the very term of whose consciousness is bliss, as in absolute existence. And there can be no nothingness, no night of unconscious, no deficiency, That is to say, no failure of force. For if there were any of these things, it would not be absolute. So also there can be no suffering, no negation of delight. Absoluteness of conscious existence is the illimitable bliss of conscious existence. The two are only different phrases for the same thing. All illimitableness, all infinity. Absoluteness is pure delight. Even our relative humanity has this experience that all dissatisfaction means a limit. An obstacle satisfaction comes by realization of something withheld by the surpassing of the limit, the overcoming of the obstacle. And this is because our original being is the absolute in full supposition of its infinite and illimitable self-consciousness and self-power, a self-position whose other name is self-delight. And in proportion as the relative touches upon that self-position, it moves towards satisfaction, touches delight. The self-delight of Brahman is not limited, however, by the still and motionless position of its absolute self-being, just as its force of consciousness is capable of throwing itself into forms infinitely and with an endless variation, so also its self-delight is capable of movement, of variation, of reveling in that infinite flux and mutability of itself represented by numberless teeming universes. To lose forth and enjoy this infinite movement and variation of its self-delight is the object of its extensive or creative play of force. In other words, that which has thrown itself out into forms is a triune existence consciousness bliss. Satchidananda, whose consciousness is in its nature a creative or rather a self-expressive force capable of infinite variations in phenomenon and form of its self-conscious being and endlessly enjoying the delight of that variation. It follows that all things that exist are what they are as terms of that existence, terms of that consciousness, terms of that delight of being. Just as we find all things to be mutable forms of one immutable being, of finite results of one infinite force, as so we shall find that all things are variable self-expression of one invariable and all-embracing delight of self-existence. In everything that is, dwells the conscious force and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that conscious force. So also in everything that is there is the delight of existence and it exists and is what it is by virtue of that delight. The ancient Vedanic theory of cosmic origin is immediately confronted in the human body by two powerful contradictions, the emotional and sensational consciousness of pain and ethical problem of heaven. For if the world is be an expression of Satchidananda, not only of existence that is conscious force, for that can easily be admitted, but of existence that is also infinite in self-delight. How are we to account for the universal presence of grief, of suffering, of pain? For this world appears to us rather as a world of suffering than as a world of delight of existence. Certainly, that view of the world is an exaggeration, an error of perspective. If we regard it dispassionately and with a sole view to accurate and unemotional appreciation, we shall find that the sum of pleasure of existence far exceeds the sum of pain, the pain of existence. Appearances and individual cases to the contrary notwithstanding, and that the active or passive, surface or underlying pleasure of existence is the normal state of nature. Pain, a contrary occurrence temporarily suspended or overlying that normal state. But for that very reason, the lesser sum of pain affects us more intensely and often looms larger than the greater sum of pleasure, precisely because the latter is normal. We do not treasure it, hardly even observe it unless it intensifies into some acuter form of itself, into a wave of happiness, a crest of joy or ecstasy. It is these things that we call delight and seek, and the normal satisfaction of existence which is always there regardless of event and particular causes or object affects us as something neutral which is neither pleasure nor pain. It is there, a great practical fact, for without it there would not be the universal and overpowering instinct of self-preservation. But it is not that we see, and therefore we do not enter it into our balance of emotional and sensational profit and loss. In that balance, we enter only positive pleasures on one side and discomfort and pain on the other. Pain affects us more intensely because it is abnormal to our being, contrary to our natural tendency, and is experienced as an outrage on our existence, an offense and an external attack on what we are and seek to be. Nevertheless, the abnormality of pain or its a greater or lesser sum does not affect the philosophical issue. Greater or less, its mere presence constitutes the whole problem. All being such as another, how can pain and suffering at all exist? Thus, the real problem is often further confused by a false issue starting from the idea of personal and extra-cosmic God and a partial issue, the ethical difficulty. Satchidananda, Satchidananda, it may be reason, is God, is a conscious being who is the author of existence. How then can God have created a world in which He inflicts suffering on His creatures, sanctions pain, permissible, God being all good? Who created pain and evil? If we say that pain is a trial and an ordeal, we do not solve the moral problem. We arrive at an immoral or non-moral God, an excellent world mechanist perhaps, a cunning psychologist, but not a God of good and love, whom we can worship, only a God of might or to whose law we must submit or whose caprice we may hope to propitiate. For one who invents torture as a means of test or audience stands convicted either of deliberate cruelty or of moral insensibility, and, if a moral being at all, is inferior to the highest instinct of his own creatures. And if to escape this moral difficulty, we say that pain is an inevitable result and natural punishment of moral evil, an explanation which will not even square with the facts of life unless we admit the theory of karma and rebirth by which the soul suffers now for antenatal sins in other bodies. We still do not escape the very root of the ethical problem. Who created or why or whence was created that moral level which entails the punishment of pain and suffering? And showing that moral level is in reality a form of mental disease or ignorance. Who or what created this law or inevitable connection which punishes the mental disease or act of ignorance by a recall so terrible, by tortures often so extreme and monstrous? The inexorable law of karma is irreconcilable with the supreme moral and personal deity, and therefore the clear logic of Buddha denied the existence of any free and all governing personal God. All personality declared to be a creation of ignorance and subject to karma. In truth, the difficulty thus sharply presented arises only if we assume the existence of an extra cosmic personal God, not himself the universe, one who has created good and evil, pain and suffering for his creatures, but himself stands above and unaffected by them, watching, ruling, doing his will with a suffering and struggling world law. If not doing his will, if allowing the world to be driven by an inexorable law, upheld by him or inefficiently held, then not God, not omnipotent, not all good and all loving, on no theory of an extra cosmic moral God can evil and suffering be explained. The creation of evil and suffering exert by an unsatisfactory subterfuge which avoids the question at issue instead of answering it, or a plain or implied Manichaeanism which practically annuls the Godhead in attempting to justify its ways or excuse his words. But such a God is not the Vedantic Satchidananda. Satchidananda of the Vedanta is one existence without a second. All that is He. If then evil and suffering exists, it is He that bears the evil and suffering in the creature in whom He has embodied Himself. The problem then changes entirely. The question is no longer how can God to create for His creatures a suffering and evil of which He is Himself incapable and therefore immune, but how can the soul and infinite existence, consciousness, bliss to admit into itself that which is not bliss, that which seems to be positive negation? Half of the moral difficulty, the difficulty in its one unanswerable form disappears. It no longer arises, can be no longer be put. Cruelty to others, I remaining immune or even participating in that suffering by subsequent repentance or belated pity is one thing. Self-infliction or suffering, I being the sole existence, is quite another. Still, the ethical difficulty may be brought back in a modified form. All delight being necessarily all good and all love, how can evil and suffering exist in Satchidananda, since he is not mechanical existence, but free and conscious being, free to condemn and reject evil and suffering? We have to recognize that the issue so stated is also a false issue because it applies the terms of a partial statement as if they were applicable to the whole. For the ideas of good and evil, love, which we thus bring into the concept of the all delight, spring from a dualistic and divisional conception of things. They are based entirely on the relations between creature and creature. Yet we persist in applying them to a problem which starts, on the contrary, from the assumption of one who is all. We have to see first how the problem appears or how it can be solved in its original purity on the basis of unity in difference. Only then can we safely deal with its parts and its development, such as the relations between creature and creature, on the basis of division and duality. A way to recognize, if we thus view the whole, not limiting ourselves to the human difficulty and the human standpoint, that we do not live in an ethical world. The attempt of human thought to force an ethical meaning into the whole of nature is one of those acts of willful and obstinate self-confusion, one of those pathetic attempts of the human being to read himself, his limited habitual human self, into all things and judge them from the standpoint he has personally evolved, which most effectively prevent him from arriving at real knowledge and complete sight. Material nature is not ethical. The law which governs it is a coordination of fixed habits which take no cognizance of good and evil, but only of force that creates, force that arranges and preserves, force that disturbs and destroys impartially, non-ethically, according to the secret will in it, according to the mute satisfaction of that will in its own self-formation and self-dissolutions, animal or vital. Nature is also non-ethical, although as it progresses, it manifests the crude material out of which the higher animal evolves the ethical impulse. We do not blame the tiger because it slays and devours its prey any more than we blame the storm because it destroys the fire or because it tortures and kills. Neither does the conscious force in the storm, the fire, or the tiger blame or condemn itself. Blame and condemnation, or rather, self blame and self condemnation, are the beginning of true ethics. When we blame others without applying the same law to ourselves, we are not speaking with a true ethical judgment, but only applying the language ethics has evolved for us to an emotional impulse of recall from or dislike of that which displeases or hurts us. This recall or dislike is the primary origin of ethics, but is not itself ethical. The fear of the deer for the tiger, the rage of the strong creature against its assailant is a vital recall of the individual delight of existence from that which threatens it. In the progress of of the mentality, it refines itself into the repugnance, dislike, disapproval. Disapproval of that which threatens and hurts us, approval of that which flatters and satisfies, refined into the conception of good and evil to oneself, to the community, to others than ourselves, to other communities than ours, and finally to the general approval of good, the general disapproval of evil. But throughout the fundamental nature of the thing remains the same. Man desires self-expression, self-development. In other words, the progressing play in himself of the conscious force of existence, and that is his fundamental delight. Whatever has the self-expression, self-development, satisfaction of this progressing self is for him evil. Whatever helps, confirms, rises, aggrandizes, enables it is good. Only his conception of the self-development changes, becomes higher and wider, begins to exceed his limited personality, to embrace others, to embrace all in its scope. In other words, ethics is a stage of evolution. That which is common to all stages is the urge of Sachidananda towards self-expression. This urge is at first non-ethical, then infra-ethical in the animal, then in the intelligent animal, even anti-ethical, for it permits us to approve hurt done to others which we disapprove and done to ourselves. In this respect, man even now is only half-ethical, and just as all below us is infra-ethical, as there may be that above us, whither we shall eventually arrive, which is supra-ethical, has no need of ethics. The ethical impulse and attitude, so all important to humanity, is the means by which it struggles out of the lower harmony and universality based upon in conscience and broken up by life into individual discords towards a higher harmony and universality based upon conscience oneness with all existences. Arriving at that goal, this means will no longer be necessary or even possible, since the qualities and oppositions on which it depends will naturally dissolve and disappear in the final reconciliation. If then the ethical standpoint applies only to a temporary, though all important passage from one universality to another, we cannot apply it to the total solution of the problem of the universe, but can only admit it as one element in that solution. To do otherwise is to run into the peril of falsifying all the facts of the universe, all the meaning of the evolution behind and beyond us, in order to suit the temporary outlook and upheaval of the utility of things. The world has three layers: infra-ethical, ethical, and supra-ethical. We have to find that which is common to all, for only so can we resolve the problem. That which is common to all is, we have seen, the satisfaction of conscious force of existence, developing itself into forms and seeking in that development its delight. From that satisfaction or delight of self-existence, it evidently began, for it is that which is normal to it, to which it clings, which it makes its base, but it seeks new forms of itself, and in the passage of higher forms, there intervenes the phenomenon of pain and suffering, which seems to contradict the fundamental nature of its being. This and this alone is the root problem. How shall we solve it? Shall we say that Sachidananda is not the beginning and the end of things, but the beginning and end is nihil, an impartial word, itself nothing but containing all potentialities of existence or non-existence, consciousness or non-consciousness, delight or undelight? We may accept this answer if we choose, but although we seek thereby to explain everything, we have really explained nothing. We have only included everything, and nothing which is full of all potentialities is the most complete opposition of terms and things possible, and we have therefore only explained a minor contradiction by a major, by driving the self-contradiction of things to their maximum. Nihil is the void where there can be no potentialities, and impartial indeterminate of all potentialities is chaos, and all that we have done is to put chaos into the void without explaining how it got there. And let us return then to our original conception of Sachidananda and see whether on that foundation a completed solution is not possible. We must first make it clear to ourselves that just as when we speak of universal consciousness, we mean something different from, more essential and wider than the waking mental consciousness of the human being. So also when we speak of universal delight of existence, we mean something different from, more essential and wider than the ordinary emotional and sensational pleasure of the individual human creature. Pleasure, joy, and delight, as man uses the words, are limited and occasional moments which depend on certain habitual causes and emerge like their pain and grief, which are equally limited and occasional moments from a background other than themselves. Delight of being is universal, illimitable, and self-existent, not dependent on particular causes. The background of all backgrounds, from which pleasure, pain, and other more neutral experiences emerge. When delight of being seeks to realize itself as delight of becoming, it moves in the movement of force and itself takes different forms of movement of which pleasure and pains are positive and negative currents. Subconscious in matter, superconscious beyond mind, and this delight seeks in mind and life to realize itself by emergence in the becoming, in the increasing self-consciousness of the moment. Its first phenomenon or dual and pure, move between the poles of pleasure and pain, but it aims at its self-revelation in the purity of a supreme delight of being which is self-existent and independent of objects and causes. Just as Satchidananda moves towards the realization of the universal existence in the individual and of the form exceeding consciousness in the form of body and mind, so it moves towards the realization of universal, self-existent and objectless delight in the flux of particular experiences and objects. And those objects we now seek as stimulating causes of a transient pleasure and satisfaction, free, possessed of self, we shall not seek but shall possess them as reflectors, rather than causes of a delight which eternally exists. In the egoistic human being, the mental person emergent out of the dim shell of matter, delight of existence is neutral, semi-latent, still in the shadow of the subconscious, hardly more than a concealed soil of plenty, covered by desire with the luxuriant growth of poisonous weeds and hardly less poisonous flowers. The pains and pleasures of our egoistic existence, or when the divine consciousness flows, walking secretly in us, has devoured these growths of desire. One in the image of the Rig Veda, the fire of God has burnt up the shoots of earth, that which is concealed at the roots of these pains and pleasure. Their past and secret being, the sap of delight in them, will emerge in new forms, not of desire, but of self-existent satisfaction, which will replace mortal pleasure by the immortal ecstasy. And this transformation is possible because these growths of sensation and emotion are in their essential being, the pains no less than the pleasures, that delights of existence which they seek but fail to reveal, fail because of division, ignorance of self and egoism. Next chapter, Delight of existence, solution. On this conception of a In this conception of an inalienable underlying delight of existence, of which all outward or surface sensations are a positive, negative, or neutral play, or waves and formings of that infinite being, we arrive at the true solution of the problem we are examining. The self of things is an infinite, indivisible existence. Of that existence, the essential nature of power. Power is an infinite, imperishable force of self-conscious being. And of that self-consciousness, the essential nature of knowledge of itself is again an infinite, inalienable delight of being, in the formlessness and in all forms, in the eternal awareness of infinite and indivisible being, and in the multiform appearances of unit division. This self-existence preserves perpetually its self-delight, as in the apparent inconscious of matter, our soul, growing out of its bondage to its own superficial habit and particular mode of self-conscious existence, discovers that infinite conscious force, constant, immobile, brooding. So in the apparent non-sensation of matter, it comes to discover and attune itself to an infinite conscious delight, imperturbable, ecstatic, all-embracing. This delight is its own delight. This self is its own self in all. But to our ordinary view of things and view of self and things, which awaken and moves only upon surfaces, it remains hidden, profound, subconscious, and as it is within all forms, so it is within all experiences, whether pleasant, painful, or neutral. And that too hidden, profound, subconscious, it is that which enables and compels things to remain in existence. It is the reason of that clinging to existence, that overmastering will to be translated vitally as the instinct of self-preservation, physically as the imperishability of matter, mentally as the sense of immortality which attends the formed existence through all the phases of self-development, and of which even the occasional impulse of self-destruction is only a reverse form, and an attraction to other state of being, and a consequent recoil from the present state of being. Delight is the existence, delight is the secret of creative, delight is the root of birth, delight is the cause of remaining in existence, delight is the end of birth, and that into which creation ceases. From Ananda says the Upanishad, all existences are born. By Ananda they remain in being and increase. To Ananda they depart. As we look at these three aspects of essential being, one in reality, trying to our mental view, is separable only in appearance. In the phenomenon of the divided consciousness, we are able to put in the right place the divergent formula of the whole philosophy, so that they unite and become one, ceasing from their age-long controversy. For if we regard world existence only in its appearances, and only in its relation to pure, infinite, indivisible, immutable existence, we are entitled to regard it, describe it, and realize it as Maya. Maya in its original sense meant a comprehending and containing consciousness capable of embracing, measuring, and limiting, and therefore formative. It is that which outlines, measures out, molds, forms in the formless, psychologizes and seeks to make knowable the unknowable, geometrizes and seeks to make measurable the limitless. A lot of the word came from its original sense of knowledge, skill, intelligence to acquire pejorative sense of cunning, fraud, or illusion. And it is in the figure of an enchantment or illusion that it is used by the philosophical system. The world is Maya. World is Maya. World is not unreal in the sense that it has not has no sort of existence. For even if it were only a dream of the self, still it would exist in it as a dream, real to it in the present, even when ultimately unreal. Not out to nor out we to say that the world is unreal in the sense that it has no kind of eternal existence. For although particular worlds and particular forms may or do dissolve physically and return mentally from the subconscious from the consciousness of manifestation into the non-manifestation, yet from form in itself, world in itself are eternal. From the non-manifestation, they return inevitably into manifestation. They have an eternal recurrence, if not an eternal persistence, an eternal immutability in the sum and foundation, along with an eternal immutability in aspect and apparition. Nor have we any surety that there ever was or ever will be a period in time where no form of universe, no play of being is represented to itself in the eternal conscious being, but only an intuitive perception that the world that we know can and does appear from that and return into it perpetually. Still, world is Maya because it is not essential truth of the infinite existence, but only a creation of self-conscious being, not a creation in the void, not a creation in nothing and out of nothing, but in the eternal truth and out of the eternal truth of that self-being, its continent, origin and substance of the essential real existence, its form or mutable formations of that to its own conscious perception, determined by its own creative conscious force. They are capable of manifestation, capable of non-manifestation, capable of other manifestation. We may, if we choose, call them the illusions of the infinite consciousness, thus audaciously flinging back a shadow of our mental sense of subjection to error and incapacity upon that which, being greater than mind, is beyond subjection to falsehood and illusion. But seeing that the essence and substance of existence is not a lie, and that all errors and deformations of our divided consciousness represent some truth of the indivisible self-conscious existence, we can only say that the world is not essential truth of that, but phenomenal truth of its free multiplicity and infinite superficial mutability, and not truth of its fundamental and immutable unity. If, on the other hand, we look at the world existence in relation to consciousness only and to force of consciousness, we may regard, describe, and realize it as a movement of force obeying some secret will, or else some necessity imposed on it by the very existence of the consciousness that possesses or regards it. It is then the play of Prakriti, the executive force, to satisfy Purusha, thus regarding and enjoying conscious being, or it is the play of Purusha reflected in the movements of force and with them identifying himself. World, then, is the play of the mother of things, moved to cast herself forever into infinite forms and avid of eternally outpouring experiences. Again, if you look at the world exists rather in its relation to the self-delight of eternally existent being, we may record, describe, and realize it as a Leela, the play, the child's joy, the poet's joy, the actor's joy, the mechanician's joy, or joy of the soul of things, eternally young, perpetually inexhaustible, creating and recreating himself in himself for the sheer bliss of that self-creation, of that self-representation, himself the play, himself the player, himself the playground. These three generalizations of the play of existence in its relation to the eternal and stable, the immutable Satchidananda, starting from the three concepts of Maya, Prakriti, and Lila, representing themselves in our philosophical systems as mutually contradictory philosophies, or in reality perfectly consistent with each other, complementary and necessary in their totality to an integral view of world life and the world. The world of which we are a part is, in its most obvious view, a movement of force, but that force, when we penetrate its appearances, proves to be a constant and yet always mutable rhythm of creative consciousness casting up, projecting in itself phenomenal truths of its own infinite and eternal being, and this rhythm is in its essence, cause and purpose, a play of the infinite delight of being ever busy with its own innumerable self-representations. This triple or trine view must be the starting point for all our understanding of the universe, since then, the eternal and immutable delight of being moving out into infinite and variable delight of becoming the root of the whole matter. We have to conceive one indivisible conscious being behind all our experiences, supporting them by its inalienable delight and affecting by its moment the variations of pleasure, pain, and neutral indifference in our sensational existence. This is our real self. The mental being subject to the triple vibration can only be a representation of a real self put in front for the purposes of that sensational experience of things, which is the first rhythm of our divided consciousness in response and reaction to the multiple contacts of the universe. It is an imperfect response, a tangled and discordant rhythm, preparing and preluding the full and unified play of the conscious being in us. It is not the true and perfect symphony that may be ours if we can once enter into sympathy with the one in all variations and attune ourselves to the absolute and universal dire passion. If this view be right, then certain consequences inevitably impose themselves. In the first place, since in our depths we ourselves are that one, since in the reality of our being we are the indivisible all consciousness and therefore the inalienable all blessed, the All the disposition of a sensational experience and the three vibrations of pain, pleasure, and difference can only be a superficial arrangement created by that limited part of ourselves which is uppermost in our waking consciousness. Behind there must be something in us, a much vaster, profounder, truer than the superficial consciousness, or which takes delight impartially in all experiences. It is that delight which secretly supports the superficial mental being and enables it to persevere through all labors, sufferings, and ordeals in this agitated moment of the becoming. That which we call ourselves is only a trembling ray on the surface. Behind is all the vast subconscious, the vast superconscious, profiting by all these surface experiences and imposing them on its eternal self, which it exposes as a sort of sensitive covering to the contacts of the world. Itself veiled, it receives these contacts and assimilates them into values of a truer, a profounder, a mastering and creative experience. Out of its depths, it returns them to the surface in forms of strength, character, knowledge, impulsion, whose roots are mysterious to us because our mind moves and quires on surface and has not learned to concentrate itself and live in the depths. In our ordinary life, this truth is hidden from us or only dimly glimpsed at times or impartially held and conceived. But if we learn to live within, we infallibly awaken to this presence within us, which is our more real self, a presence profound, calm, joyous, and poisoned, of which the world is not the master. A presence which, if it is not the Lord Himself, is the radiation of the Lord within. We are aware of it within, supporting and helping the apparent and superficial self, and smiling at its pleasures and pains as at the error and passion of a little child. And if we can go back into ourselves and identify ourselves, not with our superficial experience, but with that radiant penumbra of the divine, we can live in that attitude towards the contacts of the world and standing back in our entire consciousness from the pleasures and pains of the body, vital being and mind, poses them as experiences whose nature, being superficial, does not touch or impose itself on our core and real being. In the entirely expressive Sanskrit terms, there is an Anandamaya behind the Manomaya, a vast bliss self behind the limited mental self, and the latter is only a shadowy image and disturbed reflection of the former. The truth of ourself lies within and not on the surface. Again, this triple vibration of pleasure, pain, indifference, being superficial, or being an arrangement result of our imperfect evolution, can have in it no absoluteness, no necessity. There is no real obligation on us to return to a particular contact, a particular response of pleasure, pain, or neutral action. There is only an obligation of habit. We feel pleasure or pain in a particular contact because that is the habit of a natural form, because that is the constant relation the recipient has established with the contact. It is within our competence to return quite the opposite response. Pleasure where we used to have pain, pain where we used to have pleasure. It is equally within our competence to accustom the superficial being to return instead of the mechanical reactions of pleasure, pain, and indifference that free reply of inalienable delight, which is the constant experience of the true and vast bliss self within us. And this is a greater conquest, a still deeper and more complete self-position than a glad and detached reception in the depths of the habitual reactions on the surface. For it is no longer a mere acceptance without subjection, a free acquiescence in imperfect values of experience, but enables us to convert imperfect into perfect, false into true values, a constant but veritable delight of the spirit in things taking the place of the duality experienced by the mental being. In the things of the mind, this pure habitual relativity of the reactions of pleasure and pain is not difficult to pursue. The nervous being in us indeed is accustomed to a certain fixedness, a false impression of the absolute in these things. To it, victory, success, honor, good fortune, of all kinds of pleasant things in themselves, absolutely, and must produce joy as sugar must taste sweet. A defeat, failure, disappointment, disgrace, evil, fortune, of all kinds are unpleasant things in themselves, absolutely, and must produce grief as wormwood must taste bitter. To vary these responses is to it a departure from fact, abnormal and morbid. For the nervous being is a thing enslaved to habit and in itself means the means devised by nature for fixing constancy of reaction, sameness of experience, the settled scheme of man's relations to life. The mental being, on the other hand, is free, for it is the means she has devised for flexibility and variations, for changes and progress. It is subject only so long as it chooses to remain subject, to dwell in one mental habit rather than in another, so long as it allows itself to be dominated by its nervous instrument. It is not bound to be grieved by defeat, disgrace, loss. It can meet these things and all things with a perfect indifference. It can even meet them with a perfect gladness. Therefore, man finds that the more he refuses to be dominated by his nervous and body, the more he draws back from the implication of himself in his physical and vital parts, the greater is his freedom. He becomes the master of his own responses to the world's contacts, no longer the slave of his external touches. In regard to physical pleasure and pain, it is more difficult to apply the universal truth, for this is the very domain of the nervous and the body, the center and seat of that in us whose nature is to be dominated by external contact and external pressure. Even here, however, we have glimpses of the truth. We see it in the fact that according to the habit, the same physical contact can be either pleasurable or painful, not only to different individuals, but to the same individual under different conditions or at different stages of its development. We see it in the fact that men in the periods of great excitement or high exaltation remain physically indifferent to pain or unconscious of pain under contacts which ordinarily would inflict severe torture or suffering. In many cases, it is only when the nerves are able to reassert themselves and remind the mentality of its habitual obligation to suffer that the sense of suffering returns. But this return to the habitual obligation is not inevitable. It is only habitual. We see that in the phenomena of hypnosis, not only can the hypnotized subject be successfully forbidden to feel the pain of a wound or puncture of one in the abnormal state, but can be prevented with equal success from returning to his habitual reaction of suffering when he is awakened. The reason of this phenomenon is perfectly simple. It is because the hypnotizer suspends the habitual waking consciousness, which is the slave of nervous habits, and is able to appeal to the subliminal mental being in the depths. The inner mental being, who is the master, he reveals of the nervous and their body. But this freedom, which is affected by hypnosis abnormally, rapidly, without true possession by an alien will, may equally be won normally, gradually, with true possession by one's own will, so as to effect partially or completely a victory of the mental being over the habitual nervous sections of the body. A pain of mind and body is a device of nature, that is to say, a force in a works, meant to subserve a definite transitional end in her upward evolution. The world is, from the point of view of the individual, a play and complex shock of multitudinous forces. In the midst of this complex play, the individual stands as a limited constructed or being with a limited amount of force, exposed to numberless shocks which may wound, maim, break up, or disintegrate the construction of what he calls himself. Pain is in the nature of nervous and physical recoil from a dangerous or harmful contact. It is a part of what the Upanishads call jugupsa, the shrinking of the limited being from that which is not himself and not sympathetic or in harmony with himself. Its impulse of self-defense against others. It is from this point of view an indication by nature of that which has to be avoided or, if not successfully avoided, has to be remedied. It does not come into being in the purely physical world so long as life does not enter into it. For till then, mechanical methods are sufficient. Its office begins when life, with its frailty and imperfect position of matter, enters on the scene. It grows with the growth of mind in life. Its office continues so long as mind is bound in the life and body which it is using, dependent upon them for its knowledge and means of action, subjected to their limitation and to the egoistic impulses and aims which are born of those limitations. But if and when mind in man becomes capable of being free, unegoistic, in harmony with all other beings, and with the play of the universal forces, and the use and office of suffering diminishes, the raison d'etre must finally cease to be, and it can only continue as an atavism of nature, a habit that has survived its use, a persistence of the lower in the as yet imperfect organization of the higher. Its eventual elimination must be the essential point of the desire in the distant conquest of the soul over the subjection to matter and egoistic limitation in mind. This elimination is possible because pain and pleasure themselves are currents, one imperfect, other perverse, but still currents of delight of existence. The reason for this imperfection and this perversion is the self-division of the being in his consciousness by measuring and limiting Maya, and in consequence an egoistic and piecemeal instead of a universal reception of contact by the individual. For the universal soul, all things and all contacts of things carry in them an essence of delight, best described by the Sanskrit aesthetic term rasa, which means at once sap or essence of a thing and its taste. It is because we do not seek the essence of the thing in its contact with us, but look up only to the manner in which it affects our desires and fears, our cravings and shrinkings, that grief and pain, imperfect and transient pleasures or indifference, that is to say, a blank inability to seize the essence or the forms taken by the rasa. If we could be entirely disinterested in mind and not and impose the detachment on the nervous being, the progressive elimination of this imperfect and perverse forms of rasa would be possible, and the true essential taste of the inalienable delight of existence in all its variations would be within our reach. We attain to something of this capacity for variable but universal delight in the aesthetic reception of things as represented by art and poetry, so that we enjoy that the rasa or taste of the sorrowful, the terrible, even the horrible or repellent. And the reason is because we are detached, disinterested, not thinking of ourselves or of self-defense, jugupsa, but only as a thing and its essence. Certainly, this aesthetic reception of contact is not a precise image or reflection of the pure delight which is supramental and supra-aesthetic. For the latter would eliminate sorrow, terror, horror, and disgust to their cause, while the former admits them. But it represents partially and imperfectly one stage of the progressive delight of the universal soul in things in its manifestation, and it admits us in one part of our nature to that detachment from egoistic sensation and that universal attitude through which the one soul sees harmony and beauty, where we divided being experience rather chaos and discord. The full liberation can come to us only by a similar liberation in all our parts. The universal aesthetics, the universal standpoint of knowledge, the universal detachment from all things and its sympathy with all in our nervous and emotional being. Since the nature of suffering is a failure of the conscious force in us to meet the shocks of existence and a consequent shrinking and contraction on its root in an is an inequality of that receptive and possessing force due to our self-limitation by egoistic consequent on the ignorance of our true self, of Satchidananda. The elimination of suffering must first proceed by the substitution of titiksa, the facing, enduring and conquest of all shocks of existence, for jugupsa, the shrinking and contraction. By this endurance and conquest, we proceed to an equality which may be either an equal indifference to all contacts or an equal gladness in all contacts. And this equality again must find a firm foundation in the substitution of the Satchitananda consciousness which is all bliss for the equal consciousness which enjoys and suffers. The Satchitananda consciousness may be transcendent of the universe and aloof from it. And to this state of distant bliss path is equal indifference. It is the path of the aesthetic, or the Satchitananda consciousness may be advanced, transcendent and universal, and to this state of present and all-embracing bliss, the path is surrender and loss of the ego in the universal and position of the all-pervading equal delight. It is the path of the ancient Vedic sages, but neutrality to the imperfect touches of pleasure and perverse touches of pain is the first direct and natural result of the soul's self-discipline, and the conversion to equal delight can usually come only afterwards. The direct transformation of the triple vibration into ananda is possible, but less easy to the human being. Such then is the view of the universe which arises out of the integral Vedantic affirmation. An infinite, indivisible existence, all blissful in its pure self-consciousness, moves out of its fundamental purity into the varied play of force that is consciousness, into the movement of Prakriti which is a play of Maya. The delight of its existence is at first self-gathered, absorbed, subconscious in the beds of the physical universe, then emergent in a great mass of neutral movement which is not yet what we call sensation, then further emergent with the growth of mind and ego in the triple vibration of pain, pleasure and indifference, originating from the limitation of the force of consciousness in the form and from its exposure to shocks of the universal force which it finds alien to it and out of harmony with its own measure and standard. Finally, the conscious emergence of the full Satchitananda in its creations by universality, by equality, by self-possession and conquest of nature. This is the course and movement of the world. It is then, if it then be asked why the one existence should take delight in such a movement, the answer lies in the fact that all possibilities are inherent in its infinity, and that all delight of existence in its mutable becoming, not in its immutable being, lies precisely in the variable realization of its possibilities. And the possibility worked out here in the universe of which we are a part begins from the concealment of Sachina and that which seems to be its own opposite and is self-finding amid the terms of that opposite. Infinite being loses itself in the appearance of non-being and emerges in the appearance of a finite soul. The infinite consciousness loses itself in the appearance of a vast indeterminate unconscious and emerges in the appearance of a superficial limited consciousness. Infinite self-sustaining force loses itself in the appearance of a chaos of atoms and emerges in the appearance of the insecure balance of a world. Infinite delight loses itself in the appearance of the insensible matter and emerges in the appearance of a discordant rhythm of varied pain, pleasure and neutral feeling, love, hatred and indifference. Infinite unity loses itself in the appearance of a chaos of multiplicity and emerges in a discord of forces and beings in which seek to recover unity by possessing, dissolving and devouring each other. In this creation, the real Satchidananda has to emerge. A man, the individual, has to become, and to live as a universal being. His limited mental consciousness has to widen to the superconscient unity in which each embraces all. His narrow heart has to learn the infinite embrace and replace its lusts and discards by universal love and his restricted vital being to become equal to the whole shock of the universe upon it and capable of the universal delight. And his very physical being has to know itself as no separate entity but as one with the and sustaining in itself the whole flow of the indivisible force that is all things. His whole nature has to reproduce in the individual the unity, the harmony, the oneness in all of the supreme existence, consciousness, bliss. Through all this play, the secret reality is always one and the same delight of existence, the same in the delight of the subconscious sleep, before the emergence of the individual, in the delight of the struggle and all the varieties, vicissitudes, perversions, conversions, reversions of the effort to find itself amid the mazes of the half-conscious dream. of which the individual is the center, and is the delight of the eternal superconscious self-position into which the individual must wake and dare become one with the indivisible Sachidananda. This is the play of the One, the Lord, the All, as it reveals itself to our liberated and enlightened knowledge from the conceptual standpoint of this material universe.